Welcome to Nursing Uncensored, the show where I have real conversations with nurses and allied health professionals about all things in the nursing universe. I'm your host, Adrianne Benning, and I am here to bring you another conversation. This podcast is meant to bring education, advocacy, and laughter to nurses and students, and nothing is off limits. We're always honest, but we're not always safe for work, so please listen responsibly. Today, it is a beautiful, sunny, hot day in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We've got return guest David Metzger, RN, aka Nurse Papa. Welcome, Nurse Papa. David, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. It's so good to talk to you again. I thought we had a really great discussion last time, and I'm looking forward to doing it again.
Yeah, and since then, I feel like I've kind of been keeping up with you anyway, listening to the podcast and like kind of following along on social media. So the last time we talked was actually back in February of, God, what year is it? February of 2020.
What year is it, Adrian?
What? Yeah. When was that? It's 2021. So yeah, we talked just like it seems like so long ago.
I mean, a pandemic ago.
Yeah, only a pandemic ago. So I'm curious. I kind of just want to jump right in and ask you. I've been dying to know, actually. Pretty serious. I've got a big smile on my face, but let me calm down because this is a serious question. I've been wondering, I know how we've fared the pandemic in the adult world, but you work in. Well, first of all, before I get too far ahead of myself, introduce yourself, because I was just going to say your field and everything. But for those who don't know you, they should go back and listen to the previous episode. But catch people up to speed. What do you do? Where are you from? What kind of nurse are you?
My name is David Metzger. I am a pediatric oncology nurse, and I work out of San Francisco, California at UCSF Benioff's Children's Hospital, where I take care of kids with cancer. Mm-hmm. And I recently wrote a book about my experiences as a nurse and as a parent and the really strange intersection of those two worlds. And it's called Nurse Papa, and it's out now.
And I've read pages and pages of it. I haven't finished it yet, but I've torn through. It took me like basically the better part of a day, and I couldn't put it down. And
that's was why I put glue on the cover for you, so you couldn't put it down.
No, but really, it's and a couple of the stories that are in the book I've heard, because you tell some of these stories on the podcast in kind of an abbreviated form, if you will. I felt like I got a deeper look inside of some of these stories in the book. But yeah, pediatric oncology, I mostly have adult nurses, grown-up nurses on the show. We haven't talked a lot about pediatrics on Nursing Uncensored, not because I've made any conscious choice, but just because I don't know a lot of peds nurses. So I'm really curious, kind of what I was alluding to just a minute ago. What was COVID like in not only the world of oncology, where you're constantly worried about infection and keeping your patients protected, but now pediatric oncology, where you've got already very concerned, involved parents, but now you've got a pandemic on your hands. And what was that experience like, being in a pandemic in California with these kids that you're trying to protect?
Yeah, I mean, it was so challenging, so horrible for the parents of these kids, mostly. I mean, as nurses, as you know, we just roll with it, right? You do what you have to do to keep your patients healthy. And so infection control was primary on our mind. Everybody's wearing masks. Who enters the hospital is very scrutinized. But, the real lasting effect of this for our families was that, parents couldn't really be at the bedside with their kids the way they used to be. Before, we had a very relaxed visiting policy. You have kids who have cancer, kids who are going through bone marrow transplant, and we don't stop these parents from being with them in a way that's so important for them to heal and to get better through this really, really hard time. But we just couldn't do that with COVID. I mean, for a long, long time, it was only one parent at the bedside all the time. So a kid couldn't have his mom and dad there in the hospital, which is something that was so alien to me. And so it's such a big ask of these parents to do, but most of them understood. And despite the difficulties of the situation, I think we did our best to to nurture these kids and nurture these families. But it was beyond challenging and continues to be challenging because COVID is not over. You know, we've already gone up a tier since, you know, this last couple of weeks because Delta is surging pretty much everywhere. So
all this time has passed, and yet we're still, still having to worry about protecting our patients and ourselves and our own families. You've got kids at home.
I do have kids at home, and, you know, we've been navigating that with, you know, who takes care of them. But, you know, ultimately you have to trust the system that you work in. I trust the hospital. They're doing everything they can to keep our kids safe. And I trust my kids' school system because, you know, ultimately that's what you have to do. I've learned very much so that so many things are out of our control, and we really need to do our best to trust the systems that we put our kids in.
Absolutely. And that can be really scary, you know, depending on where you live and whether or not you have leaders that are doing right by you. I know that's a concern all across the country.
Yeah.
But yeah, having parents at the bedside is crucial for these kids. And so to have to limit their time at the bedside, you know, having to pick which parent is there, especially when we're talking about, you know, kids that are dealing with some pretty rough stuff. And I know that we talked in our last episode about how a lot of these kids are also facing end of life. Did you guys make any exceptions for kids that were nearing end of life?
Absolutely. I mean, there has to be an exception because
I agree.
it only happens once, right?
Right.
So, you know, while still being safe, we would let many more caregivers at the bedside. Of course, you know, it would often be on a rotating way in which, you know, we could have 3 to 4 caregivers there and then 3 to 4 caregivers come after that. You know, before you could have an entire room full of parents and aunts and uncles and cousins in the room who were there to watch, you know, to be there with this child when they died, when they passed away. And it always has been so interesting to me that life always goes on, even as somebody's life is passing. You know, you would have all these microcosms of family situations happening in a child's room, cousins playing on the floor, uncles and aunts joking with each other. And all the while there's a small child in the bed, you know, having trouble breathing on, you know, increasing medications to keep him or her comfortable. And it's almost like it's often been like a family reunion in a way, but they're not there to see how each other has been. They're there to be with this child as he or she is dying. And that wasn't possible in the same way during COVID, and continues not to be possible.
It's the same in the adult world. We would have, you know, our rooms for our palliative and end-of-life patients. They're huge. They're way bigger. And we have couches in there, and it's the same. People bring food. They hold vigil. You know, this is an important time. And so to have that changed in such a direct way is really hard for those kids, the families. So yeah, I didn't want to start on a sad note, but I was just really curious about that because it is such an impactful part of the work we do. And, you know, as we talk about the future and what our plans are, I think we need to really take time to acknowledge that among all the joy we experience and the love that we have for our work, that we still have all these challenges that haven't gone away yet. And since we hadn't talked in so long, I just had this ferocious curiosity because I know you guys are protective of your kids and that those families come with those kids. It's a package deal, you know?
It sure is. Family-centered care.
Yeah. So I think it's important that these stories are told. And one way that you found to do this is through your book, Nurse Papa. And I know you got a copy of it down there. You've got one of your pre-release copies. But I want to talk a little bit about, first, before we talk about the content of the book, because we've already alluded to a little of that, I want to talk about the process that you went through making this book. Because as I already know, our audience may not know, this is a large part of your time that you've spent working on this. This is, in fact, another kind of child of yours, I would imagine. This is like and in the first episode, or the first chapter that you read in one of your episodes, one of your kids says, "You mean the book you've been talking about nonstop for forever, Papa?"
Yeah. I don't know if your listeners know, but I do have a podcast also called Nurse Papa. And I recently did read the first chapter of the book, and my daughter is my little partner on my podcast. So she often, in a very unfiltered way, tells me how she feels, and I do not edit that.
Well, I gotta say, I just want to talk for a second. Nurse Papa is your podcast. And I've said before in the first episode, and I'll say it again, I do not have children. I do not plan to have children. But as a non-parent, who I generally don't have interest in that sort of thing, I'll just be honest. I absolutely adore your podcast. Your kids bring a flavor and a life. The sound bites, the interjections that they have in your show, especially your daughter. I love the way you talk about both your kids, but the way you talk about your daughter, it makes me laugh. It warms my heart. I feel like I know her in some way. I relate to her so hard in so many ways. Her little wild spirit. But yeah, so you've got the podcast that talks, a lot about the stories you have in the book, but the book that she knows you've been working on forever. How did that come to pass? What were those first moments of I need to write this stuff down?
I mean, it was not a deliberate process. I've always expressed what I'm going through in my life through art, whether it was when I was younger and I was a sculptor, or when I was a new father and I put on a one-man show about being a new dad. I've always had to take my life and filter it through art. And, when I started Nurse Papa, it was basically me just being in a room with a patient and his or her family, and just being amazed by what I saw, what I heard, what was happening in the room. And at some point, I just knew that these scenes had to be shared with somebody else. People had to be able to understand what it was like to be in these rooms with these kids as they suffered, as they laughed, as they lived, and as they died, and maybe get something out of it, because there's so many horrible moments in life, but especially on a pediatric oncology floor, there's so many horrible moments that you witness and take part in. But I thought maybe that there'd be a real benefit to people to experience these moments, but not live them. Because with all the horribleness, there's also so much transcendence, and there's so much to learn from these kids. And what better way to, give that lesson than to tell these stories?
Yeah. And I feel like I have learned from these kids, listening to these stories, just the appreciation, the story. I don't want to give away any of your stories, but there are stories where you talk about these kids who have so much insight. I feel like they,
Yeah.
and we've talked about it before, kids pick up more than we realize. And you talk about how, parents are often given the news of their new diagnoses without the kids present, because kids, they need to see their parents in control and in strong positions, and not necessarily having these potentially, emotional, dramatic responses. But I think it's also because kids pick up on such subtleties. They pick up on even the things that we don't say, the facial expressions, the body language. In our last episode, I went back and listened to it. We talked about how moms can tell if kids have fevers by the way their kids are acting. Mm-hmm. And we had this moment of what? The kid's acting like they have a fever. So I feel like that connection between kids and parents is so much stronger than someone like me who doesn't have kids, or perhaps a nurse who doesn't have children, or, doesn't have those children. They don't understand that connection necessarily. So for me, it was interesting to read these stories and realize that it's a lot of times it's the unspoken stuff that conveys the most information, and just the way, again, these stories take you from understanding from the kid's perspective, understanding from your perspective, getting a glimpse of how the parents feel, I feel like when I'm reading these stories, I'm trying to take in so many different concepts. I didn't get bored reading these stories. And I don't mean to say that that sounds rude, but like you do sometimes listen to like little snippets of stories and they read quick and then you're done with it and you're on to the next story. But these are stories that I think they beget thought. Like I feel like I need a minute in between each one.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, it's not a long book, but and each chapter, it's 5 to 9 pages, but it can take you a while to get over a chapter because,
well,
they're very impactful.
in the first paragraph, I'm like laughing my ass off. And then the next paragraph, I'm like, oh, that's that's kind of heartbreaking. And then
Yeah,
in the
well,
next paragraph, I'm like, oh, that's kind of creepy. And then in the next paragraph, I'm like, oh, that's the cutest, sweetest thing. I feel like my emotions, I'm riding this wave, which is probably a lot of what this feels like for the people involved in the stories. There's no
absolutely.
one true emotion riding through these experiences. So I feel like I feel like you're a really good storyteller, and
Well,
that
the stories
you
are there for me to present to
for
the
you to
reader.
tell. Yeah.
And and Adrian, one story, you asked me how I decided to write this book, and I don't know if you've read this far into the book, but there's a chapter called "You Can't Fix Everything," and it's about this patient, Jason, who, over the course of 2 weeks, I met and watched him die, and it was really after that experience that I decided I needed to write this book. He came to us and he came for a liver transplant, so he was already a very morbidly ill kid. And when the surgeons did a more complete workup on him, they realized that he had a giant tumor wrapped around his liver. Like, this kid was not getting a liver transplant; he was going to die. And to go from the expectation of a better life to the imminent idea that you're going to die was a huge switch for this kid. Not only was he in just tremendous pain, he had this existential pain. He was a teenager and he was fully aware of what was happening, and he just shut down.
Yeah.
He was just the pain within him. And I took care of him over a course of 2 weeks, and I can't say I ever really understood him or connected with him until this moment, right before he died, when I gave him a bath. And I I think that as parents and as caregivers, we often think we can fix people, that we can take their pain away. But that's often not possible. But there is a way to connect with people so they know that you understand their pain. And having this very intimate moment with Jason, in which I gave his very withered body a bath, I think it allowed him to see my humanity, and it really allowed me to see his as well. And I remember after that, I was with Jason in his room, and he was lying down, and I thought he was sleeping, and the lights were off, and I was just charting at his bedside. And all of a sudden, he said, "David." And he'd never said my name before. I was just this caregiver to him. I said, "Hey, Jason, what's going on?" And he said, "Do you have cats?" And I said, "Well, we do have a cat. We have a toddler too, so the cat doesn't get too much attention." And he said, "Well, we have cats too. We have 3 of them, but one of them got sick and we had to put her down." And I said, "Jason, that's really sad. I'm sorry that you lost your cat." And he said, "It's okay, because if you love cats, you have to get used to them dying." And it became very clear in that moment that Jason, although he was talking about his cat, he was talking about himself. And to see this boy have this clarity that if he loved life, he had to be okay with dying, the fact that he was going to die, and the fact that all of us are going to die. It was just such an impactful moment for me when I realized that, we're all in this together and we're all traveling this very uncertain road. But when we really, truly relate to each other, we're able to understand each other. And then he died a week later. So that's what made me want to write this book.
David, you got me crying again.
I was wondering how long it would take.
It didn't take long, but I mean, this is what was happening during the book too. Like I'd go from crying to like laughing on the next page. But I mean, this is true. These are the things that you learn from kids, because
Yeah.
kids go through a lot of stuff too. And like I said, they understand more than we realize. And, sometimes it's because they're faced with this stuff that they never should have to face. But when we listen, we get to hear these things, and you clearly are listening. So
Yeah,
I
I
think,
do a lot of listening
yeah.
because
And
I find that that's often what people need to do,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
I am I'm very male-like in the sense that I've always tried to fix things, but and failed miserably. But listening sometimes
sometimes you
doesn't
can't.
feel like you're doing something because you're passive and you're there. But there's something called active listening, where you affirm how somebody feels and you relate to how they feel, and you don't bring the story back to yourself, but you bring it back to them. And in that way, you can really help people by not doing anything at all.
Yeah. And that's a quality I've had to really develop because I like to talk. And listening is definitely a skill. Listening is something that takes practice. And I think that when we listen to our patients, we learn a lot more about them, and not just about like what they need medically, but what they need just in their experience and just being.
Yeah.
Um,
And we're taking care
and
of hearts too, right?
yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, it's all part of the same person,
Yeah.
and on the adult side of things, I've had those experiences too, where like, I've been given the patient that in report, they're like, "Oh, he's a grouch. He doesn't want anything. He's a mean old man, blah, blah, blah." And then these are the people that I have like the heartfelt conversations with in the middle of the night that they're like, "Come here, sweetheart, sit down and talk with me."
Yeah.
And they just needed somebody that wasn't gonna like be his wall and then put up their wall and then we're all walled off. He needed somebody to have their wall down in that
Yeah.
moment.
Whenever I get a report like that, I always take it with a grain of salt. Like, this
I do
parent
too.
is really difficult, or this child will not listen. And I feel like what we bring into the room is very important. So if you come into the room having never met a patient or their parents and you immediately expect to get a hard time, you're probably going to get a hard time. But
Yeah.
if you are open to their experience and pretend that you don't know anything about them, you can often be surprised by what you find.
And you also have to ask why. Why
Hmm.
are you why are you a difficult, if that is true, if that quote unquote, and I hate
Sure.
those words, but if you are a difficult patient,
Yeah.
why? Is
What
it because you're
experiences did you have?
scared?
Yeah.
Yeah, is it because somebody treated you bad? Is it because you're on guard? Is it because, what is it? And sometimes it takes those moments of just stopping and listening.
Yeah. It
And
requires that
those,
you're a curious person too.
yeah, and those are the victories. Those are the moments when I know that I've been a good nurse and that you can know that you've been a good nurse is when that patient who's never said your name before, I've had that happen as well, where patients that I thought just thought of me as, oh, she's just another one of the nurses,
You're the
has
girl with the
said,
morphine.
yeah, has said to me like, "Oh, good, it's you." And I'm like,
Uh-huh.
"What? What do you mean, oh, good, it's me?" Well, I don't feel I can talk to anybody else about this. I can talk to you about this. And up until then, you thought that this person just tolerated your presence because you were
Yeah.
just on the clock that day.
Yeah. I mean, we
I've
both
had those
know,
experiences.
and we both know that the biggest compliment that any patient or patient's family can give to their nurse is that little question that happens right at the end of the shift. Are you going to be back tomorrow? Because you know
Yeah,
that they felt heard by you, they felt taken care of by you, and that they want you back.
yeah,
It feels really good.
it does. It does. And I can't remember, I'm trying to remember who I talked to about this, but I think you can probably relate to this. I can't remember if we talked about this in our last episode. All of my episodes are kind of blending together. But one of the biggest compliments that I get is, I've taken care of patients that are either have lifelong chronic illness, so their parents are with them, even if they're not really young, or I've had patients that are like just over the cusp of adulthood. And so they're new to the adult inpatient world. So they have their parent with them. Parent is primary caretaker, whether that patient is like quadriplegic or is, totally dependent in some way. And I know that when I have a vigilant parent that is always at that bedside, that is always involved in cares, that is always watching what my hands are doing, when that parent falls asleep in the middle of the night, in the middle of my shift, in that recliner, and they're snoring, trusting that I am taking care of their child,
Yeah.
that is like one of the highest compliments I can
Oh,
get as a nurse,
absolutely.
is when that hyper vigilant, terrified, eagle-eyed parent is like, I can get a full night's sleep knowing that
I can
this
sleep
nurse
because I
is
know
here.
Adrianne is my nurse.
Yes, yes. Those are the things that make me go, I'm killing it tonight. Yes.
Yeah, and we
So,
all know how hard it is to sleep in the hospital and to exist in the
yeah.
hospital. And that's when I have a whole chapter about how parents need to take care of themselves.
Yes.
Um, and it is a great compliment when parents allow themselves to give in to the pure exhaustion that they're feeling
Yeah. Yeah. So,
because they know they're going to be safe.
yeah. So I knew that you would appreciate that sentiment.
Yeah.
Um, so you've been writing these stories. These are very emotional, very personal stories. It's out now. It's out for me to purchase, for our listeners to purchase. How does it
hmm
feel to have these? I mean, obviously you wanted to share these things, but how does it feel knowing that all of this stuff is out? I mean, this is your work, your baby out in the world. It must
Yeah.
feel good and scary and you
Yeah, it's
know,
my very difficult baby. I don't know how it feels. I told you earlier that when I got the first copy of the book, I didn't feel how I expected I would. I thought I would, do some kind of backflip commercial dance or something where Simone Biles backflip, but it
you're
didn't
doing
happen.
TikTok dances.
I don't even know how to use TikTok. I have six followers on TikTok, um, but it wasn't like that. I actually felt really sad, and which is typically me because I've spent 5 years writing and crafting this book and getting it out there to the world because it wasn't easy. I had to convince a publisher that people would want to read about kids with cancer because it's so much more.
Mhm.
It's about life, it's about love, it's about loss, and it's about learning. Um, I felt really sad because all that time, which I'm deep in the red as far as time spent writing this book, it was all bound up in 190 pages, and it felt so inconsequential to me in that moment to just be holding it. And I don't know, it's complicated for me. I I really hope that people read this book and get something out of it. I hope that they see themselves in it, even if they're not parents, because it's a lot more. This book is a lot more um, about life and all these experiences we share than it is about being a parent. Although I think parents can appreciate it in a very special way.
Special way, yeah. But it also made me laugh in a lot of ways. So in the very first chapter, which we're going to talk about, or which we're going to play at the end of this episode, so I want everybody to stick around. You get to listen to the first chapter, which you read, and I love listening to you read these stories. I think that I don't know, maybe I'm overselling it, but I like your podcast. So
Thank you.
certain people have good voices for reading. Some people just, you just like to listen to them talk. You fall in that category for me. But in the story, the very first chapter, you're talking about this little girl and she's singing this tune about how, well, I don't want to give it away, but this little girl singing this tune. And it made me think about how kids just make up songs about
hmm
whatever, they just make up songs. And it made me think of this little kid that was on my unit once. But this was long before COVID. It was there was a fella that had his wife was learning how to do cares. He had a tracheostomy and he was going home with it. So his wife was learning how to do cares, and they had their kids with them, and their kids were kind of little wild animals all over the place, but they were very cute. And this kid was this kid was running up and down the hallway going suction, 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 because I guess he had never heard the word before.
Uh-huh.
And the nurses kept saying, like, do you need suction? Do you need suction? And this little boy just kept being like, suction, suction, suction. And that song, thinking of her, even though the story is very touching and it's very beautiful, it made me think of this little kid like skipping up and down the hall singing this song. It's like in any other world, like if this kid were in Target or like at the grocery store and he's just like skipping up and down the aisles going, suction, suction. I don't know. It brought this like absurd scene to me that in the hospital made perfect sense. We were all just like, oh yeah, he's learning how to do this. This is like normalization. Like daddy's coming home. But just the things that we see and do that are sometimes absurd. And it just reminded me of that kid. And, but yeah, throughout the book, like I said, I'm kind of swinging the pendulum of emotions, and I really enjoy that about it.
I mean, that was unavoidable because, this is real life. But one thing I really did try to do with this book, because it can get so heavy sometimes, is I included these chapters called breaks from the Heartbreak that kind of pop up every 2 chapters and really reveal a very comedic situation, either in the home or hospital, that that you can really relate to and laugh at. And it's funny, comedy is not always about things that are funny. Sometimes it's about things that are really tragic. And, it's naive to think that happiness and sadness are 2 distinct experiences that exist apart from each other. But in life, and especially in the hospital, and especially where I work, they are bound in the same situation all the time. And you just have to accept them both for what they are and appreciate them and learn from both.
And I've had patients that are, dealing with a lot of terrible health problems, and their sense of humor is the thing that gets them through. I've had patients that have made jokes that by any other circumstance would be considered like completely inappropriate. But for them, it's like how they cope, it's like,
oh yeah.
There are patients that I've taken care of. I can't think of like any specific jokes, but there are patients that I've taken care of that like maybe have a loss of limb or something like that. And I'll be like, hey, where do you want me to put this? And she'll be like, put it by my left arm. She doesn't have a left arm. So, I mean, there are these jokes that people make. And then, they try to trip you up. And when the nursing assistant or whoever goes to put it by their left arm and they see she doesn't have one, and they're like, and she's like, she gets a little giggle out of it, but I mean, sometimes things that most people would find like kind of morbid, kind of weird, that's their normal life. They have to joke about it. Or, like ostomy bag farts. Like sometimes as a nurse, I can't help but laugh. And then the patient laughs and then we're all laughing. And, it's a funny moment, but at the same time, it's also like a really messed up moment because this poor person has a brand new colostomy bag, So there are these moments where like you find humor in like kind of tragic situations. But like you said, this is life. Life is messy. Life is complicated.
And there is a chapter in the book called The Ghost Fart. I'm not sure if you made it to that yet, but I'm not going to give it away. But
I can't wait. I'm like a 14-year-old boy when it comes to farts. I'm sorry. They're always funny.
Yeah. And there's one moment at the end of the book that I want to tell you about, because I don't think you read the whole thing yet.
Not yet.
And it really displays this kind of mix of emotions of pain and sadness and happiness and grief. There was this child who was passing away, and he was 3 years old, and he was deep into agonal breathing, the kind of breathing where you stop and there's nothing for a minute, and then just a deep, deep inspiration that's, driven as much by the dying brainstem as it is, by this child's, need for oxygen. And it was in one of those moments that this child hadn't breathed for about a minute, and then his nurse put her stethoscope to his chest, and right at that moment he stood up, up in bed and breathed very, very deeply, and the nurse jumped back and yelled because she was so scared. She wasn't expecting it. And in that moment, his parents, who had been at his bedside, and been taking care of him for so long, started laughing. Everybody in the room started laughing because it was the last joke that he played in his life on his last nurse. And, sometimes there's nothing to do but laugh. And it doesn't mean we're not sad, but it means that we know that life is about more than being sad.
Right. And we're complex people. Those feelings can exist in the same space. I feel like I've said this multiple times in recordings that I've done recently. Like, we have this guilt when we like laugh when we should feel sad, or when we have a good day when we think we should be having a bad day because of the conditions that exist. But it all happens at the same time, like
Yeah.
we're allowed to feel these complex feelings. And to outsiders, it may seem strange, but that's how the human body works. That's how it's both beautiful and complicated and strange at the same time, is that you can be feeling terrible and then something can happen and you can burst into laughter.
Life is messy. And I think nurses, out of all the people, understand that.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And people that have, been around hospitals for any length of time understand that.
Yeah.
And
Patience.
yeah, patients, family members, support people, they all start to get it after a while. So you talked to other people when you were gathering these stories. So how did that work? Like how did you gather like what part of this is sourced and what part of
Uh-huh.
this is like how did that work?
Yeah. I mean, when people are trying to give advice on writing a book, they say, write what you know, which is what I did. I would observe these situations and I would write them down and I would try to find the truth in whatever I witnessed. But I can't be in every room at every moment. So it felt really important to me to get a perspective that wasn't mine because ultimately this book is not about me. It's told through my eyes, but it's also told through so many other, hearts and minds. So I felt it was really important to talk to the people who experience these things. And that meant, visiting with my colleagues and sitting down with them for many hours and getting their stories, getting their perspectives, finding out what, this all meant to them. And then I've tracked down patients' parents, people who I became really close to in the hospital. Almost uniformly, these parents had kids who had died because it's just the way it worked out. So when you become close to these parents, there's a connection that doesn't ever really go away because you were the last person who took care of their son or daughter, and they come to depend on the nurses just as much as they come depend on their families, sometimes even more, because we uniformly understand what it's like to be in that room. We don't understand the grief they have, but we understand what it's like. And we were there, we were witness. So, I've been able to form some pretty deep connections with these parents. And, we don't talk or text all the time, but we're connected and it's never going to go away. So, a lot of these parents felt really comfortable sitting down with me and telling me their stories. And, it's such a privileged experience to sit in somebody's living room and have a cup of coffee and talk to them about their son or daughter who you both know so well. Because you're not in the hospital room anymore. You are just there with them. You are friends and you are in this very intimate space. And for that reason, I think I was able to capture something that was really elusive, which is what it's like to be a parent of a child who died, and maybe coming out on the other side of it. And the answer was never easy. The answer was also often very confusing and difficult, but it was true. And, super valuable for me because I don't have that experience. I've taken care of kids who have died, but I don't have the experience of being a parent to a child who passed away. Thank God I don't. I don't ever want that experience. And that's why I thought people would really appreciate this book, because you're able to learn about this without experiencing it.
Mm-hmm.
You can close that book and come away with something and then go out and take your kid to the park. Mm-hmm. So that was really valuable to me. And talking to my colleagues who have very different experiences than me was really valuable. And I thought it was really cool to take these stories that weren't always, something I'd witnessed firsthand, and to put in their voices and to allow them to have a platform.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's such an important message, that you can come away with something without having to experience it. I mean, I think that's absolutely true, even for me. Like I not only do I also understand the sentiment of not ever wanting to experience the loss of a child. But as someone who doesn't have children, like I know I won't be in that position, but that also means that empathy, people say that like you don't understand what it's like until you have kids of your own. And in some ways that is, that's very true. Like you talked about how you thought you had this this perfect understanding of kids, and then you had kids and you were like, oh my God, this is totally different. Like, what did I even think? How did I
Yeah.
even dare say some of these things? But I think that it's important also because as a nurse, and as a nurse who has taken care of people who have, I feel weird saying like adult patients that are still having their parents come in with them, like very young adult patients. I often don't get the opportunity to have those conversations with them because, the difference maybe is that they're the parent of that adult child, but that adult child is still responsible for their own health information. And so I can't, necessarily call the parent and have that discussion. So I know it's a little bit different in
Yeah.
the pediatric world.
Well, I
But
don't think we ever stop being parents. I
right,
mean,
of
I'll
course, of
tell you in 30
course.
years how I feel about my own kids, but
Yeah, but I
I'm
guess I just mean
guessing,
in terms of like talking about
yeah,
it,
it's a
after
different relationship at that
it's a
point.
different relationship. And also I think legally it's different as well because, when you're talking about a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, that parent is their legal guardian and can choose to talk about those things.
Yeah.
When I have a patient that's like 22 and their parents are part of that child is their own legal entity and so can say whether or not that parent has the right to talk about, their medical record. So I guess
Yeah.
that's kind of my next question is
Uh-huh.
when you were writing this book and talking to these parents, are you using real names, real experiences? Like, did you have like permission to talk about these things, or did you have to disguise and change things for legal and HIPAA reasons?
Well, that's a great question. One thing I wanted to talk about before that was people sometimes misunderstand pediatric oncology, and they always think that you're taking care of kids. But it became abundantly clear to me as I had more and more patients that sometimes my kids were not kids. I mean, I've had patients in their 20s and 30s. They're people who have a very pediatric cancer that only we are very familiar with treating, and in our algorithms are, we got it down. And then there are kids who, they've been suffering with cancer since they were young, but, as they grew up with cancer too. It never went away, and they find themselves adults still being treated in a pediatric hospital. So for that reason, it's so amazing to have such a breadth of ages that I get to work with. I can take care of a child who's 3 weeks old, and I can take care of a man who's 25, and it's a completely different way of nursing, but I'm still a pediatric nurse.
Mm-hmm.
But to answer your question, I really left it open to the people who I interviewed. I mean, they all knew I was going to use this information for a book. That was the context by which, I got them to sit down and talk with me. Many people did not feel comfortable using their real names, so I changed their names. I often change details of, what they look like and their ages just to, not have it relate to the actual person they were. But what was really interesting to me is that many of the parents who would talk about their deceased kids really wanted their names used. They wanted them to be identified. They want the world to know who their child was. And, they often don't get that chance. And now there's a book with, whole chapters devoted to their son or daughter. And for me, I thought that was such a gift to give to them, to let that voice ring and to let people who read it truly understand how this child affected the world and really affected me, because I've been profoundly affected and moved by some of these children, and they're never going to leave me. And to be able to put that down in a book and share it with the world was really great. And like I said, I left it open to them how they wanted to be identified. And often there was just no pretense to making a disguise.
Well, David, you've accomplished, I think, a lot with this book. And I know that you said that there was like this weird, unexpected emotion with seeing this book, but I think that you should know that this book has touched my life and I haven't even finished reading it yet. And I've already felt emotions and laughed and really enjoyed reading it. And the thing is I'm not much of a reader lately. I read a lot of news articles and journals and like a lot of like nerdy nonfiction stuff. And even though this is nonfiction, this usually isn't my genre. And you've got me reading. So
Yeah, well,
that,
I'll let you in on a little secret. Since I've been writing this book, I have not read one book, which makes me feel really pathetic and sad because I used to be such a reader. I would have 10 books going at once, but once I became a parent, and certainly since I devoted most of my free waking hours to writing this book, I haven't been consuming.
you know what? Sometimes you just got to put some things at the bottom of the list for a while. And I
Yeah,
think you've put some good things at the top of the list. So
that's a really good
all
way
is
of putting it.
forgiven. I won't tell my boyfriend. He's a librarian. Shh.
Well, maybe you can convince your boyfriend to order the book.
Yeah, yeah. I'll get him to, we'll get it on the shelves. So we'll do that. But in the meantime, how can people find you and how can people get this book? Let's talk about that first.
Well, you can find me on my website, which is nursepapathebook.com. You can always find stories of parenthood and the hospital at my podcast, Nurse Papa, which is a project which I took up after I finished the book. And it was a way to bring attention to the book, but it became its whole other animal. I've really enjoyed kind of taking my everyday life and participating with my kids in kind of creating these stories for my listeners. And, one aspect of the show is I will answer a letter from one of my listeners about kind of a parenting conundrum that they have. And Nurse Papa is always a little bit cheeky. He's always giving advice that he probably could not take. But I try to present these problems in a really familiar, funny way. So along with that and the stories that I have to tell, it's been really great. So you can find that podcast. And then, of course, you can go to the almighty Amazon and find Nurse Papa the book. And you can buy either as a ebook or as a paperback. And I suggest the paperback, not because it costs more, but because sometimes it's good to hold something in your hand.
Yes, indeed. I still love having a book, the cover art, the inscriptions, the
Hmm.
smell of the paper. There's still something really nice about that.
Yeah.
So
And Adrianne, the cover of the book was inspired by a drawing that my daughter did of
it's
me and her
beautiful.
together.
I love it. I love it. And she, of course, is a princess, a queen, as she should be.
Yes,
Got a little crown on her head.
she would say she's a princess, but she's elevated to queen in my mind.
Absolutely. Well, we are going to go ahead and end this chapter with, or end this episode with the first chapter of your book. So do you want to preface this and then we will go ahead and play it for everyone who wants to stick around and listen? Everybody should stick around and listen.
Yeah, so this is the prologue to my book, and it's called That Kid Look. And it's about an encounter I had in the hospital when I was really a young nurse, and I had no idea what I was doing. And it really encapsulates everything that's in the book. Sickness and family and brotherhood and sisterhood, and how we all deal with grief and how we encounter it, and how you'll find a different thing in each room you go to, because you can really find different things when you look for it. So yeah, I'm really excited for your listeners to take a listen to it, and if you enjoy it, I highly suggest that you pick up the book, but also listen to the podcast, because I do my best to include these stories there as well.
And all of this information will be in the show notes. But for now, here is chapter 1 of the Nurse Papa book.
Chapter 1. That Kid Look. The long hallway of this hospital unit follows an elongated horseshoe pattern, with all of the patients' rooms oriented on the outside. These rooms have large windows and a striking view of the San Francisco Bay. When the light of the sun is allowed to pour in, the rooms feel airy and open. When the drapes are drawn shut and the overhead lights turned off, though, each room can be as cool and dark as the cave of a snoozing bear. Some patients prefer their space dim and silent as they sleep their way through indeterminate stays. Sleep can be preferable to the other states available to them, nausea, pain, boredom, or all three simultaneously. But there are other patients who seek the stimulus of the world on the other side of the glass. They spend their days sitting on the ledge beneath the large bay windows, their noses and hands pressed against it, smudgy marks left behind. They play with their parents and siblings, scribble at homework that not even cancer can help them escape from, or watch movies on the big screen television that seems almost as large as a studio apartment I once lived in. Outside these patient rooms, nurses in royal blue scrubs, doctors in their street clothes with stethoscopes hanging around their necks, and various other hospital staff in green, gray, and light blue uniforms roam up and down the halls. The drum of their conversations, the beeping of monitors, and the occasional blare of overhead announcements ensure a steady white noise that most who work here hardly notice anymore. Visitors unfamiliar with the long layout often find themselves fully circumnavigating the entire horseshoe shape before they find the exit, which is also the entrance. Of the long line of identical doors spaced evenly along the hallway of this pediatric oncology ward, most were shut. The sounds of sick kids and their families distilled indecipherably out into the hallway. The room I was standing near was silent, though. The inhabitants within saddened and struck mute. The girl inside, who once laughed, cried, endured, and grew bored in this room and others just like it, died early in the morning. Her name was Lucia. I remember her cute, chubby face and the tight curls of her brown hair, before it all fell out. She once wore the same flowery red dress for days in a row, despite her mom's ardent protests. Her large family sat around the bed where her body lay, sometimes speaking in hushed tones, but mostly just sitting. She was wearing that same red dress. It had thin shoulder straps. The small patterned flowers were blue and yellow. Veronica, Lucia's younger sister, could not be easily contained to a silent room. A shorter and plumper doppelganger of Lucia, she was happily playing with a small inflatable ball just outside the door, bouncing it against a wall and singing softly to herself. I first met Lucia a year or so before she died. I was a new nurse then, still walking those hallways in confused circles myself. She was a newly diagnosed cancer patient, leukemia. The first night I took care of her, I was working with a nurse who was training me. Lucia was sick and feverish, shivering in her bed. We had to wake her shortly after midnight to draw blood from her already bruised body to determine how we would treat her. Her sleepy eyes were wide and fearful of the advancing needle that I held. My hand was shaking with nervousness, while her hand, my tiny target, was strangely still. If they were interested, the bookies in Vegas would have offered equal odds over who was more scared in that moment, me or the prepubescent girl from whose body I was about to draw blood. Rivulets of sweat dripped from my brow as I pushed the needle into her skin and connected to her vein. Still standing outside the door where Lucia's body lay, I was shaken from this memory by the phone buzzing in my pocket. When I answered it, I heard the muffled request of a mother asking for medication for her vomiting son. As I walked quickly to help them, I made sure to end the call from the boys' room. I once forgot to do this before placing my phone back into the front pocket of my scrubs, and the young girl and her mother were treated to the unmistakable sounds of a grown man using the restroom. I passed by an open door. Inside was a bored teenage girl. She was lying in bed and watching TV. Her skin was pale. Her smooth head was covered by a beanie that her mom had knitted at her bedside. A catheter exited at the point on the right of her chest and connected to a tangle of clear plastic tubes that led to a humming medication pump next to her bed. A tray of untouched food sat ignored in front of her. She waved and smiled as I passed by. The next door over was closed. I could hear a loud yell from the child within, but it was not clear to me if it was a laugh or a cry. Here, where the expression of every possible human emotion is not only accepted, but expected, it can sometimes be difficult to distinguish between the two. Just before I entered the room to which I had been summoned, I could hear the boy retching and coughing inside. I noticed Veronica, Lucia's look-alike sister, next to me. She had migrated down the hall while I was lost in the memory of her older sibling. She was still playfully distracted in her own little world. Veronica was quite used to this place by now, a veritable sibling appendage. The bouncing ball had escaped from her grasp, and she was chasing after it, away from the hospital room where her sister's body, still in that red dress, lay. As she skipped down the hallway, her arms stretched out in front of her, she sang loudly enough for me to hear her words. The tune was some variation of a common nursery rhyme, but the words were all her own.
My sister's an angel. My sister's an angel. My sister's an angel. My sister's an angel.
She sang between giggles. Clearly, one of her family members had tried to explain Lucia's death in a way that a young child might understand. Her refrain reminded me of a scratch record, upon which the needle was not merely stuck, but almost willing itself into action. The ball she had been chasing came to rest against the side of the hallway. Pausing in her song, Veronica stared at me with a blank kid expression that seemed to convey neither trust nor suspicion, but rather some emotion in between. It puzzled me at the time. Now, years later, with over a decade of pediatric nursing and 6 years of child rearing under my belt, it is a look I have come to know all too well. It is the same faraway glance that my precocious 6-year-old daughter routinely drops on me when she possesses neither the words, desire, nor patience to tell me what is really on her mind. I wanted to say something meaningful to this girl with a newly dead sister, something that would explain why this was all happening, but I had no good explanation for it. Only useless platitudes came to my mind. Ignoring me fully, she began her refrain again. This time, it was only a hum, but her words stayed with me.
My sister's an angel. My sister's an angel. My sister's an angel. My sister's an angel.
Then, for no apparent reason, the skipping record in Veronica's mind stopped. She picked up her ball and headed back in the direction from which she had come.